Cold air cut across the open fields outside Falls City, Nebraska, on the night Brandon Teena stepped out of the small white house on the edge of town. It was just after Christmas 1993. The gravel roads were slick. Inside the house, he had been laughing only hours earlier, drinking with people he thought were his friends. By the time he stepped outside that night, the mood had shifted. The men who followed him out the door were no longer joking. They had questions, and they wanted control of the answers. Brandon had arrived in Falls City a few months earlier, leaving behind a difficult life in Lincoln. Born in 1972 and assigned female at birth, he had long rejected that identity. He lived and presented as male, introduced himself as Brandon, dressed in men's clothes and dated women. In Lincoln, that had created tension with family, with authorities, and with people who saw him as deceptive instead of seeing him as a young transgender man trying to live honestly. Falls City, with its cheaper rents and slower streets, seemed like a chance to start over. There, he fell in with a group of young working-class friends who spent their nights driving back roads and hanging out in small bars. Among them was a woman named Lana Tisdell. Brandon and Lana grew close quickly. He paid attention to her in a way she wasn't used to, and they began dating. To Lana and many of her friends, Brandon was just another young guy who had landed in their orbit, charming and a little vague about his past. Two of the men in that circle were John Lauder and Tom Nissen. Both were older than Brandon, with criminal records and reputations for violence. At first, they accepted him. He drank with them, rode around with them, and joined their late-night drives. But his relationship with Lana and his refusal to explain certain parts of his life soon bothered them. When they learned, through rumors and then contact with law enforcement, that Brandon was transgender and had a pending charge in Lincoln, their attitude turned from suspicious to hostile. By late December, the tension exploded. On the night of December 25th into the early hours of December 26th, Lauder and Nissen confronted Brandon about his identity. They forced him into a car under the pretense of driving around, then turned on him. What followed was a prolonged assault that mixed physical violence with humiliation. They beat him, tore at his clothes, and used their discovery about his body as a weapon, taunting him and accusing him of lying to Lana and everyone else. The attack escalated into rape, carried out in isolated spots away from town where they believed no one would see. When they were done, they threatened him. If he went to the police, they said, they would kill him. Then they dumped him near a rural area and left him to find his way back. Injured and terrified, Brandon made his way to a nearby house and contacted friends. With their support, he went to the hospital and reported the attack. Doctors documented his injuries. Law enforcement officers, including the Richardson County Sheriff, took statements. The reaction from authorities was chilling. Instead of focusing on the crime, the sheriff fixated on Brandon's gender identity. During the recorded interview, he pressed Brandon with intrusive, mocking questions about his body and his relationships, treating his identity as the problem rather than the violence he had endured. The tone made it clear Brandon could not rely on him as an ally. Lauder and Nissen were briefly picked up for questioning, then released without charges while the case was under investigation. For Brandon and the people trying to protect him, that release changed everything. The men who had attacked him now knew he had gone to the police. Friends urged Brandon to leave, to go back to Lincoln or farther away, but he hesitated. He did not have much money, and there were unresolved feelings with Lana, who was still trying to absorb what she had learned about his past and what had been done to him. In the final days of December, Brandon stayed at a farmhouse outside Humboldt, Nebraska, where a friend named Lisa Lambert lived. The small house, surrounded by fields and gravel roads, offered distance from Falls City. Lisa had a young child, and another friend, Philip Devine, was also staying there. It was an improvised refuge at the end of a brutal year, a place where Brandon could lie low and try to decide his next step. On December 31st, 1993, just before dawn, that isolation turned against them. Lauder and Nissen, drunk and armed, drove to the farmhouse knowing Brandon was likely inside. They forced their way in, moving from room to room. What followed happened quickly but with deliberate intent. They found Brandon first. He had tried to hide, but there were few places to go. The men confronted him at gunpoint. This time there would be no threats about what might happen if he talked. Their purpose was to make sure he never testified. Brandon was shot at close range. The wounds were fatal. Lauder and Nissen then turned their weapons on Lisa Lambert and Philip Devine, killing them to eliminate witnesses. By the time they left, 3 people lay dead in a quiet farmhouse that had been a temporary shelter. A baby in another room was physically unharmed, but left alone amid the bodies until the crime was discovered. The crime scene investigators entered later that day was the result of choices made long before the trigger was pulled. The decision by Lauder and Nissen to target Brandon for his gender identity, the decision to escalate from threats to murder, and the failures of law enforcement to act when Brandon first reported the assault. If the earlier report had been taken seriously and charges pursued promptly, the attackers could have been in custody instead of free to carry out the killings. In the weeks that followed, the investigation closed in. Witnesses came forward. Both Nissen and Lauder were arrested. Nissen eventually cooperated with prosecutors, providing testimony that detailed their involvement in both the assault and the triple homicide. He received a life sentence in exchange for his cooperation. Lauder was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. His case moved through years of appeals. Brandon's murder forced questions about how the legal system treated transgender victims of crime. Advocacy groups pointed to the sheriff's handling of the rape report as an example of bias that helped enable the later killings. Lawsuits were filed against Richardson County and the sheriff, alleging negligence and failure to protect. A civil jury later found the county partly liable, awarding damages to Brandon's mother. The case also reached wider audiences through long-form reporting and the film Boys Don't Cry, which dramatized Brandon's life and death. Not every detail matched the record, but the attention brought his story to people who might never have heard his name and pushed more of the country to confront what had happened in rural Nebraska. Behind the headlines and courtroom transcripts, the core of the story remained simple and devastating. A young man trying to live as himself in a small town was targeted, assaulted, and ultimately murdered because of who he was, and because the people responsible believed they could act without consequence. The gaps in the system, the mocking questions, the lack of charges after the report, the delay in taking his fears seriously, left him exposed. The farmhouse where Brandon spent his last night was just another rural home, ringed by open fields and quiet roads. For a brief time, it seemed like a place where he could catch his breath and decide what to do next. Instead, it became the scene of a crime that would be studied, argued over, and remembered for what it revealed about violence, identity, and the cost of indifference. Thank you for listening to Homicide Files. Subscribe for more true crime stories.